Welcome back to Ralph's Sort of True Stories. As you recall, we've been going around this assisted living center trying to find out what life is really like. And we've been to the rec room and the sunroom and down the hallways and around the front desk. So I just want to wrap up with a few stories about my father. You remember, he was the one I was checking this assisted living center out for. And then my dad tells me a story that happened to him recently. He was sitting out on his porch, and he was watching this guy that's his same age. And this guy's running. And he's running like a mile, 2 miles, all around the neighborhood. And finally the guy stops, and Dad says to him, he says, "You know, I admire you." He says, "I could never run that far." He says, "I could never run." What do you attribute that to, your energy level? He said, "Rye bread." "Rye bread?" He said, "Rye bread." He says, "It not only gives me that energy," but he kind of pats inside of his legs and he says, "Yeah, and it helps me with the ladies too, if you know what I mean." So my dad says, I immediately go down to the bakery and I ask for rye bread. And there's a young lady behind the counter and she says, "How many loaves do you want?" And he says, "I want 5 loaves. Now, if you knew my father, if one's good, 5's got to be better. So she says, "You want 5 loaves?" He says, "Yes, I want 5 loaves." He says, "Well, you know, with 5 loaves, it's going to get hard." He says, "How come everybody knows about this but me?" And I says to him, I said, "Well, Dad, I didn't know you had any kind of an erectile dysfunction problem, but I guess at your age it would seem logical." He says, "Well, you know, I've got that girlfriend. She's only 62 years old." I said, "Really?" He says, "Yeah, and I was having a little trouble because she was, very demanding, very active. So I didn't want to take that Viagra because I heard about, what could happen if it lasted after 4 hours and all that. So I went up there to the Hopi Reservation in northern Arizona, and they took me in, and they put me in the sweat lodge, and they started burning these incense and sweating, and there's chanting, and apparently I go into some kind of a trance, and after a while I come out of it, and I said, "What happened?" And the shaman, the medicine man, he says, "Well, you're cured." He says, "Well, how do I know I've been cured?" He said, "All you have to do is say 1, 2, 3." And he says 1, 2, 3, and old Mr. Johnson perked right up. Dad says, I thought, man, this is going to be good. But then I remember that Viagra stuff. I said, well, wait a minute. How do I get it to go back down when I want it to go back down? And the guy says, well, you just say 1, 2, 3, 4. And when the guy said 4, Mr. Johnson goes back to sleep. So Dad told me, he says, I got back home. I went out on a date with that girlfriend. I got her in the sack. I used every move I could remember from back when I was a teenager. I got her hot and bothered. I got her begging for it. And so then I say 1, 2, 3, and Mr. Johnson stands right up, and I'm ready to go. And she says to me, what'd you say 1, 2, 3 for? I'm sitting around still listening to the different conversations, and by this time the band started, and they're playing some old Glenn Miller stuff. And here one guy danced by me with this other older lady, and he says to her, he says, do you like sex? And she says, infrequently. And he looks at her very quizzically, and he says, is that one word or two? I'm thinking, this guy's pretty sharp. Well, then my dad gets up to dance. And he gets this lady out, and by that time they're playing a swing tune, and he's out doing the jitterbug, and he's swirling her and pulling her in and everything. And finally she says, Galen, be careful. I have acute angina. He says, don't worry about it, sweetheart. I have a pretty pecker. So, as stories go, and this one does too, I got Dad all signed up there, and he's living happily ever after. And I want you to remember this. When you come back to this site, it's Ralph's Sort of True Stories. Now, to help you remember the Ralph part, I want you to think back sometimes when you overdrank and you're kneeling in front of the porcelain princess and you're regurgitating, we call that barfing, and you're going, Ralph, Ralph, Ralph. So, when you want another Sort of True Story, remember, Ralph's Sort of True Stories. Thank you.